So much everyone for joining this session as part of the TASO and Sutton Trust Conference. This session focuses on going beyond 2022 and beyond post-qualification admissions to think about radical long-term solutions from around the globe. And we're really pleased to have some great and very interesting panelists with us today. So first of all, I will introduce myself, although I don't count myself as one of the great and really interesting panelists because I have the honor of chairing. But so first of all, we've got Professor Harry Brighouse from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Second, Dr. Karen Stegers-Jaeger from Erasmus University Rotterdam. And third, Dr. Omar Khan, Director of TASO. So just a little bit of housekeeping. First of all, so most of you, I think, will have attended the session this morning. And so you will know all of this, but very quickly, you are automatically muted and your videos are off. If you would like to ask a question of our panelists, please use the Q&A function. If you use the chat function, we won't be able to answer your question. Please enter your questions at any point, but we will have a Q&A at the end. And we will try to get through as many questions as possible in the allocated time. Last of all, we are recording this session and we will distribute the recording afterwards. And just to say, attendees and panelists, please do tweet about the event using the hashtag FairAdmissions2022 and or beyond PQA and mentioning both TASO HE and the Sutton Trust. And I realized I said I was going to introduce myself and then I forgot to. So I'm Susanna Hume, I'm Director of Evaluation in the Policy Institute at King's College London. So to start the session, each of our speakers is going to have about 10 minutes for some opening remarks on their reflections on what we can learn from education systems around the world. So I will hand over to Professor Harry Brighouse to start us off.
So before I get into what happens in admissions in the US, it would be that might be useful. You need to understand some key differences in the higher education ecosystems. First, most students in the US attend institutions that are not selective at all. All you need is a high school diploma. That's about 70% of students, and only 10% of students attend institutions that reject more than half of their applicants. Second, as I'm sure you do know, sticker prices vary enormously. So Ivy League plus schools have sticker prices upwards of $60,000. That's about £45,000 a year, and full cost of attendance can be $75,000, $80,000. And remember, the degree is 4 years and not 3. Most selective public universities have sticker prices in the low teens of dollars per year for state residents, but those vary widely for non-residents who typically are seen as revenue producers. Third, very few people pay the sticker price, the full high sticker price at the private universities. Most wealthy selective institutions cross-subsidize heavily, using full-freight students to subsidize low-income students and offering discounts to students who they really want, that is, students with high prior achievement or potential. The classroom is a little bit like an airplane. You know what you paid, but you really have no idea what the person who's sitting next to you paid. They may have paid a lot more than you, they may have paid a lot less than you. And in fact, if they're low income, if the institution is rich enough or the student poor enough or high achieving enough, they may have paid nothing. Fourth, students from low income families who are admitted to highly selective institutions usually pay little or nothing in tuition. But most low income students don't know this. So although the decision where to attend is not very price sensitive, the decision where to apply often is. So I've taught plenty of students at Madison who, if they'd understood the system, would have applied to and attended equally selective private schools for free or nearly free, but because they didn't, went to the best state school in their state and went into debt. Finally, a word about K-12. In England, the school funding formula results in lower income students attending primary and secondary schools that have much more to spend than schools with more affluent students. And in the US, it's complicated, but the reverse is the case. The 10% of schools with public schools, state schools, with the most affluent students in them have a lot more to spend than the 10% with the least affluent. And what that results in, it sort of predictably, is a lot more spending on more affluent students, even by the government, which means that they're much better prepared for college than less well-off students. So now I've said that about the ecosystem, here are some observations about what we do in admissions and enrollment management that might be helpful for rethinking in the UK. First, admissions in selective schools is holistic. So let's ignore the super selective, what my friend John Buckenstedt calls highly rejective schools, and just focus on the institutions below them, the state flagships, the less famous small liberal arts colleges, and the private research universities without large endowments. These typically have 4 pieces of information about their applicants. First, the SAT or ACT score. So these are standardized tests in reading and math that they resemble the old 11 plus, except they're for 18-year-olds. Second, high school grade point average. This is the average of the students' grades, all given by the school and by the teachers for every course they took over the 3.5 full years of attending high school. Third, AP scores. That's scores in a variety of externally marked exams that resemble A-levels in form and are probably somewhere between GCSEs and A-levels in terms of their difficulty and rigor. Finally, school level information about how difficult and rigorous the school's courses are. That's the academic information they have from students. Of course, they also know a lot about the students' family incomes, partly by direct information, but they also know the ZIP +9 code for the student, which tells you how wealthy or poor their immediate neighborhood is. In addition, the candidate may provide an essay or two, and there'll be recommendations from teachers. So what the institution doesn't do, I don't know any institution that does this, which I believe most UK institutions do, which is admit the students with the highest GPA or SAT or GPA SAT function. They're trying to construct a class that is diverse on numerous dimensions. Regional, geographic representation matter, especially to the state schools. Getting a socioeconomic mix matters, race matters. So I think does sex. A number of admissions officials have told me off the record that they have rough targets for getting enough boys to attend, and that if they didn't and just used academic merit, the sex ratios would disfavor boys even more than they currently do. The high school you went to matters. GPA is a construct of teacher assigned grades, and different schools apply different standards, so do different teachers within schools. Lots of colleges know to the teacher level how, what the grading practices are like. And admissions officers want to see how rigorous the course of study was in the high school you went. So if you went to a high school which had very rigorous grading, and you took a less rigorous course of study, you're at a disadvantage relative to somebody who took the most rigorous courses available in their less rigorous high school. If you want to enroll plenty of low-income students, you are going to admit high-income students who are less well qualified, because you want them to come and pay full freight so that you have the money that enables you to cross-subsidize the low-income students. And so to achieve all of these goals, which include the goal of ensuring that you have well-qualified lower-income students attending, you have to apply quite different standards to different categories of student. So what does this lead to in practice? Well, the first thing to note is that some people who get preference, so athletes, legacies, the children of large donors, all of whom are admitted on, to all of whom lower academic standards are applied, they're less academically well prepared than the average student, and they do fine. They are also, on average, all of those groups socioeconomically more advantaged than the student bodies they join. So you might think that it would be different if you lower the academic standards for less well-off students. But the evidence, at least within public institutions, is that lower-income students are well advised to attend the most selective school that will accept them. They succeed at a lower rate than more affluent students, but at a higher rate than identical students who attend less selective institutions. The same is true for race. Affirmative action means that selective institutions apply lower academic standards when admitting Black than white students, and those Black students are more successful than their identical peers who attend less selective schools. The same appears to be true of admissions to professional schools like law and medicine, which are not undergraduate degrees in the US, they're postgraduate degrees. And we've considerable evidence that professional students from racial minorities and low income and rural backgrounds are more inclined to serve the community they come from than students who are not from those backgrounds. So the experience in the US suggests that giving preference to lower income students is entirely feasible and consistent with their success. What explains the success of students who benefit from preference relative to their matches who attend less selective institutions? So I think that the economists think that there are four main factors, and it's really important to understand these factors in order to sort of understand how you would apply the lessons. First is peer effects. If you're at a more selective institution, you're around students who are more ambitious, better trained, and have better academic support. We know that peer effects have considerable play in high school, and elementary and high school attendance. And we also know they have an effect in college roommate allocations, and we think they do in classrooms too. Second, money almost certainly has an effect. Remember, the more selective institutions, being richer, can provide more aid. So counterintuitively, it's often cheaper for lower income students to attend more expensive institutions. Another corollary of the variation in sticker prices is an unsurprising variation of resources available for instruction and student support. So, this is kind of shocking. If you go to a private institution that is highly selective, something like 4 times as much money is spent on your instruction than if you go to a private institution that is much less selective. That's a lot of money. For public institutions, the differential is not as large, but it's still 2.5 times. The final thing that I think it's really important to understand is programming. So most selective institutions devote resources to building cohorts among low-income students, special advising, and other kinds of support. At Madison, which is not particularly wealthy compared with similarly selective institutions, we have summer programs for incoming underrepresented first-year students. They arrive on campus 4 weeks, 6 weeks, sometimes 8 weeks before the other students. They've established themselves here. All of that is paid for by us, not by them. And they're in programs right off the bat in their first year, where they have much more intensive mentoring, much more intensive academic advising, and much more intensive support. So my remit was to talk about the US admission systems in ways that relate to the UK experience. And what I take away from the experience is it's entirely feasible to provide more access to elite higher education for poor and working class students, and for them to flourish in that environment. But I would say, if you want to do that, you want to make sure that they're successful, and the right kinds of support do seem to enable them to be successful. So I'm done.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that, Harry. And also, I think is it 5:21 in Madison right now?
It is 5:21. Yes, it is. And it is minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit outside.
Well, thank you so much for joining us so early in the morning for some really interesting comments about the American system, which I think, for me at least, has brought a lot more nuance to the way my understanding of the way things work in America, which I think is, provides some really interesting insights for how we could think about things differently here. So I'm now going to pass on to Dr. Karen Stegers-Jaeger from Erasmus University Rotterdam for her opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Susanna. I would like to share my screen. you see my screen right now, or full screen as well?
Yeah, we can, yes.
Okay, great, thanks. So good morning to you all. My name is Karen Stegers-Jager. That's the Dutch pronunciation, but I won't ask you to repeat that in that way. I'm an assistant professor at the Institute of Medical Education, Rotterdam Medical Education Research in Rotterdam, the Netherlands. And I feel very honored to talk to you today about the question whether lottery can lead to diversity. So you probably will all be aware of the importance of creating a diverse student population, because this will better prepare our students for their, sorry, I'm a bit struggling with my presentation. Very sorry about that. This will better prepare our students for their role as medical professionals in a diverse society, and also improve their educational experience. Additionally, diversity amongst healthcare professionals is required to solve persistent ethnic health disparities. However, there are concerns that the current selection procedures that we're using in medical education will hamper the diversity of our student population. So, but when we look at the Dutch situation, we had a 100% lottery from 1972 till 1999. Although this lottery system was weighted for a pre-university grade point average, there was still no guarantee that excellent students could enter medical school. So in 1997, a brilliant candidate failed to get into medical school 3 times in a row. So the following national debate resulted in a new law that enabled direct access for candidates with the highest grades and allowed schools to select up to 50% of their students using their own selection procedure. So the medical schools themselves could decide on their selection criteria, but at that time were not allowed to use pre-university grades. So the percentage of students who were admitted via the school-specific procedures has steadily increased from a maximum of 50% in 2000 to currently 100%. So starting from the academic year 2017-2018, the national lottery system has been abolished in the Netherlands. So the main reason for the switch to 100% selection at that time were early findings that selected students performed better in medical school than lottery admitted students. Oh, sorry, now I forgot to. So before we start to look at the effect of lottery and diversity, it's good to look at what are considered minority groups in the Dutch context. So those are the ones with a migration background. So at Erasmus Medical Center, that's about 30 or 35% of our students. Those with who are first generation university students, and which might actually be surprising in the for the UK context, male students are underrepresented in the Dutch context as well. So what would we do? We looked at the different admission systems with 50, 80, and 100% selection, and we looked at the demographic composition of the different admission groups. So this learned us that in the, This learned us that in the 50% systems, students with a migration background were more likely to have entered via lottery and less likely to have entered via selection than those without a migration background. So the same applied for first generation university students, but these were additionally also less likely to have entered via direct admission, so with a high rate. There were no clear gender differences. So the findings for the 80% selection system were comparable for those with a migration background, and additionally, those with a migration background and male students were less likely to enter via participation in a scientific pre-university program. So in the 100% selection system, all minority groups were less likely to enter to direct selection than their more traditional counterparts. So it's good to realize that although those with a migration background enter more often via lottery and less often via selection, the percentage of students with a migration background has increased over the years. However, the percentage of students with first generation, who were first generation university students and male students, did decrease over the years. However, this raises the question whether this was due to our selection procedure or whether these candidates even did not apply. So what we also did is we looked at the effect of our selection procedure on the diversity of our student population. And this is a summary of what we found. So we found that those with a migration background did underperform in our selection procedure, but mainly on academic criteria. First generation students were as likely to get selected as non-first generation university students. And males outperformed females on academic criteria, so even were more likely to get in as long as they applied for medical school. We also did a multi-site study, which showed us that applicants with traditional backgrounds generally had better admission outcomes, but that there was a variety in effects of on diversity of different tools, and that the variety in effects on diversity within tools differed across contexts. So it really depended on in what kind of context you use which tool to see the, what the effect was on diversity. However, these findings raised the question in the Netherlands whether we should go back to the lottery, which we only abolished in 2017. So currently in the Netherlands, there is a law in preparation for institutional lottery. This implies that there's no national lottery anymore, but that institutions will be able to select students based on at least 2 qualitative selection criteria, or lottery, or a combination of at least 2 qualitative selection criteria and lottery. However, we also ask applicants what they think of using lottery again. And here you can see the general favorability of applicants for different tools. And you can see that weighted lottery and unweighted lottery are by far lowest, rated lowest by our candidates. Oh yeah, and there's some other differences between those with and without a migration background on different tools, but that's not focused for right now. Surprisingly enough, especially male students were not too fond of using lottery. Another recent study from the Netherlands showed that lottery might not be the solution for our problem. This was a retrospective study, and they compared the demographic compositions of the age cohort, the eligible pools, the applicant pool, and the student cohort on a national level. So, and they found that those with lower SAS and migration background were already underrepresented in the eligible pool. So that's those with the right track at pre-university level to get into medical school. And the applicant pool shows an underrepresentation of males and those without a medical doctor as a parent. So finally, in the student cohort, all 4 groups were underrepresented. So given the lack of diversity in the applicant pool, returning to lottery-based admission doesn't seem to be the solution in the Dutch context as it is right now. This raises the question in the Netherlands whether we should actually get into widening access policies. However, currently in the Netherlands, the options for affirmative actions are quite limited. As it is, we are not allowed to disadvantage group or to undermine equity, but there's also an Equal Treatment Act. So we actually are also not allowed to favor certain groups. So all applicants have to be treated equally. So there are 4 requirements for affirmative action in the Netherlands. It should be a proven disadvantage only in case of equal suitability with reason, and it should be known to applicants in advance. So this leads us to the conclusion that we're only allowed to favor ethnic minority applicants, but only with soft quota. We can only favor first generation university applicants if they are from an ethnic minority and were not at all able to mitigate the disadvantage for male students because we're only allowed to favor females. I would also like to show you a bit on a study that we did to increase the diversity with outreach activities. And we looked at the effect on different free activities, so offered by the university, and on commercial activities. And we found that male students and Western ethnic minorities were less likely to attend free activities like a coaching day in a summer school. But on the other hand, non-Western ethnic minorities were more likely to participate in a pre-academic program, but less likely to use commercial coaching. We saw that participation in activity was related to more success in the selection procedure, and particular males and those with a non-Western migration background profited from participating in the summer school. Participation was not related to better performance on the first course. So they got similar grades as non-participants, and there were also no subgroup differences. So to wrap up for my first remarks is that, so did we get diversity by lottery? First, we found that there were different demographic differences between lottery and selection students. However, this raised the question whether this was due to selection or to self-selection. Second, I showed that traditional backgrounds had better chances, but there were differences between tools and contexts, which raised the question whether we should go back to lottery. Nevertheless, lottery is not liked by applicants, and the problem tends to already start earlier in the process. So in the Netherlands, we're looking now at two types of solutions: widening access policies and outreach activities, and maybe to some extent reintroducing the lottery. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that. I think it's particularly interesting to see a case where lotteries or randomization has been used as a fairer way of assigning access to something, which is something that in the What Works Network we talk about quite a lot. I'm going to hand over now to Dr. Omar Khan, Director of TASO, for his opening remarks.
If I manage to unmute myself, there I am. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Karen and Harry, both of you for speaking. As with the previous two speakers, I have a task of summarizing how a different higher education system works and of trying to say something about what that might mean for the UK. The country I'm focusing on is India, a non-Western case, obviously, and the aspect of their admissions policy I will highlight are reservations or quotas, an issue that Mary Kernock Cook raised in the first panel. And those quotas are for the group formerly known as untouchables, but who now prefer to call themselves Dalits, a term that was popularized by the Dalit leader and first law minister of India, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, a man who completed graduate training at both the London School of Economics and Columbia University over 100 years ago. So first, I'll outline the Indian background and explain how these policies were and are justified and implemented. This will necessarily involve me explaining a bit about how these policies relate to a wider approach in India to tackling historic disadvantage in public institutions. Second, I will outline some provisional evidence from the Indian case indicating some positive outcomes of the policy, but also some of the public and political concerns about them. Finally, I'll try to say something about what that might mean for thinking about addressing disadvantage and underrepresentation in higher education through admissions policies in the UK. So a quick summary of the Indian case. As many of you probably know, the caste system is a long-standing social institution that continues to inform social outcomes and inequalities in India. Classically, there are 4 castes constituted in a hierarchy, though there's disagreement both about the origins of the system and about how well this classical formulation fits current or historic practice. Less controversial, however, is the idea that Dalits, formerly known as untouchables, are outside and below this caste hierarchy and positioned in a uniquely disadvantaged position. They were subject to ritual and social inequalities and degradations, resulting in literacy rates as low as 2% in the 1920s, circumscribed social positions, including restricted access not just to jobs and professions, but even to education and other public goods and spaces, even including roads and hotels. So from around the 19th century, social movements and policy began to develop in response to the inequalities and indignities that Dalits suffered. and that included allowing them to attend schools and enter temples, activities previously banned in many parts of the country. Further, there was the development of quotas or reservations in the colonial administration. So Dalits such as Ambedkar were key drivers of this development, as were some princely states who exercised autonomy within the colonial system. But it is also notable that the British colonial state advanced such policies for a range of groups, including Muslims as well as Dalits. So there was a pre-independence development of these policies. Following Indian independence in 1947, a constituent assembly then met to draft India's constitution, which was adopted in 1950. Through this constitution, India instituted arguably the largest scale policy of preferential policies of any country in the world. So reservations or quotas are applied in the lower house, with 15% of all seats in parliament reserved for Dalit candidates and members only, but also in public employment. For example, Indian National Railways, which is the third largest employer in the world, and educational institutions. While I cannot discuss the policy, the sort of arguments and challenges of implementing quotas in political bodies and representation, a policy that has now been extended to women at the local level of democracy with some good effects, nor can I address public employment. I think this context is important for understanding why such reservations or quotas were also adopted in higher education, including in engineering and medical colleges. So the argument that Ambedkar put forth and that was accepted in the Constituent Assembly was threefold. First, that there were backward-looking or compensatory arguments that past injustice required compensation for Dalits specifically, and that quotas or reservations were a reasonable form of compensation. Secondly, that forward-looking equal opportunities arguments that Dalits did not face a level playing field, they did not currently have equal opportunities, and that therefore reservations would enable them to do so. This recalls Lyndon B. Johnson's argument for affirmative action and that of Martin Luther King in the 1960s in America. And third, and then lastly, and one I think that is often missed, Ambedkar and others suggested an argument based around democracy, that equal participation extended not just to representation in parliament, but in other publicly important roles, including in higher education. Such an argument is arguably evident also in the Dutch case that we just heard on medical schools, but also in recent arguments in Britain that some voices have not been sufficiently heard in democratic decision-making and public debate, that unrepresented elites have captured not just political representation, but the scope of public debate and policymaking, and are overrepresented in higher education as well. It is also evident in arguments that see education, particularly where access to the benefits of education is scarce and competitive, as a public good. Having outlined this background, what do we know about the impact of reservations in India? What have they actually achieved? Well, first, evidence suggests that higher education reservations in India has increased the likelihood of Dalit and other minorities staying in secondary education longer. They see the opportunities in higher education, and that then makes them stay in secondary education longer, which has been a longstanding problem in India, with an estimated 1.2 years increase for the most disadvantaged young people. Participation in higher education has, of course, itself increased, with estimates suggesting that around half of the 700,000 Dalits attending higher education in the 1990s would not have otherwise been admitted. There is, however, less solid evidence on the degree and labor market outcomes of the beneficiaries of quotas in India. It appears that they are less likely to get good degree outcomes and have lower earnings than non-Dalit graduates. Further, there is also some evidence that the average Dalit entrant is less qualified than the average non-Dalit entrant, explaining some of the political controversy over the ongoing application of the policy. At the same time, Dalit graduates earn significantly more and do significantly better in the labor market than their parents, indicating the role of higher education reservations in breaking down historic patterns of labor market segregation. Finally, there's evidence, as there is in the United States, that medical school beneficiaries of preferential policies are more likely to practice in underserved areas. That is, in areas where there are fewer doctors per resident and currently worse public health outcomes. This increased proportion of doctors in these areas results in improved public health outcomes for minority group members, which is perhaps particularly likely and urgent in societies with significant geographical segregation of disadvantaged groups who also have worse access to public goods and services. By improving public health outcomes for minority groups, this also improves public health for everyone in society by reducing demand for emergency expensive care, and given the wider link between health inequality and health outcomes overall in society. So what does this all mean for the UK? Well, first, and I think as the previous presentations also outlined, many countries, most notably and systematically India, have adopted more interventionist or radical policies to address the underrepresentation of disadvantaged groups, and have done so through direct or targeted policies. Second, these policies have been justified with reference to wider arguments about historic discrimination, as well as equal opportunities in the labor market. Just as important, however, have been arguments that frame education as a public good and link access to that good to wider arguments about equal representation and voice. Given the link between graduate qualifications and access to publicly important jobs, whether in the professions, in politics, or in policymaking, it is surprising that this argument has been less commonly heard in the UK. Third, I think it's important to acknowledge that such policies are controversial, and in the Indian case can result in non-Dalit applicants being denied a place. If any such policies were to be considered in the UK, I think they'd need a clear and explicit justification with significant public understanding and acceptance. Fourth, and relatedly, I think it's important to identify the groups who might plausibly benefit from such policies. In India, reservations for Dalits have been less controversial than their extension to other groups, arguably because there's more widespread agreement that Dalits have been badly treated and continue to experience discrimination and unequal social outcomes due to their treatment on unequal representation. Some of the other groups who have had quotas extended to them are less universally believed to share that experience. In the UK, we heard on the first panel that the data suggests that pupils on free school meals remain very underrepresented in higher education, and that they might be considered for more targeted measures to close that participation gap, which, as Eunice Simmons in the introduction outlined, has remained stubbornly persistent over the last decade. Fifth, admissions policy in higher education cannot directly address inequalities in schooling. And I think we've heard that throughout the day, that one of the major drivers of admissions to higher education is inequalities in schooling. And this remains a major issue that needs tackling. Sixth, while there's some data on outcomes in India, and it's not surprising to hear me say this as the director of a What Works Center, we need better systematic collection of labor market outcomes, both to assess the efficacy of the policy, but also to ensure greater public confidence in the measures. Seventh and lastly, the lesson from my presentation is not that Britain should simply adopt a version of India's policy. Rather, it is to show that more explicitly targeted policies have been adopted in India, that these have had some good effects and success in tackling much more stubborn and historic inequalities than exist in Britain, and that if we do choose to adopt more targeted measures, we will need to make a more explicit argument based on education being a public good. We will also need to demonstrate through evidence that the policy does in fact have those beneficial effects, both for the individual in question, as well as for society overall. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Omar. And I'm going to ask all panelists to put their video back on now so that we can move on to the Q&A. So 3 very interesting presentations there describing 3 very different ways of trying to address inequality in university admissions. Particularly interesting, I think, for me, because I went through university in Australia, and when you move from one country to another, you become very preoccupied with how different they are. And one thing this has caused me to realize is that the Australian system is actually not that different to the British system. And there is actually a wide world of other ways that this can be done than the kind of, Anglo model. So that has been very interesting for me personally. Please do drop any questions you have for our panelists in the chat. I'm going to claim chair's privilege and start off, but hopefully we'll be able to get through everyone's questions during the session. So my first question for all 3 of you is, we've had 3 excellent and very balanced presentations talking about different models, what the pros and cons of them are, what the kind of, acceptability considerations or practical considerations around them are. But if you, if you were going to craft a university admission system, what do you think is one feature that you've kind of seen in action that you think you would really want to be included there, that you really think is probably something that helps in terms of sort of fair admissions or sort of fair access to university generally? It doesn't have to be one. Some people hate that word. It's like, pick your number one, so you can go for more than one if you like. But I might start with Harry.
Thanks. In one of the Q&A questions, I sort of said something that I hadn't really said in the talk, which is the institution. Not all institutions are interested, by the way, in getting underrepresented students in. I mean, there are institutions, and I'm not going to name them, but there are institutions that I have particular dislike for that are not interested in this at all. But institutions that are interested, not only do they give support to these students once they arrive, not only do they give preference, but they identify students early on. I mean, in middle school, certainly by the beginning of high school, and give them support through, bring them to campus in the summers. Get them the idea that they're the kind of people who go to college, and that they're the kind of people who go to this kind of college. And I think that is something. That is something, from my knowledge of the UK system, that is something that UK universities could do fairly easily. And maybe they already do it, but I'd be surprised if they go that, I mean, that sort of end of primary school, beginning of secondary school. I'd be surprised if they're doing that. And that's that I think has a big effect. And it doesn't mean that the student's going to come to your college, right? I mean, there's a what's the word, collective action problem, because they might go to some other college. If they're going to be successful, they can go where they want. I see in the chat, that there is primary outreach, but I think that's a really important, and it's outreach and support, and consistent support.
Yeah, absolutely. You've actually hit on something that is a really live conversation in the UK at the moment, in terms of what is a university's role in supporting school students right down to primary, to both kind of get the grades, but also to believe that university is an option for them. That's a very live debate that you've plugged into there, actually. So that's very interesting. Karen, any thoughts from you from the Dutch case?
Yeah, thank you very much. Actually, two things come to my mind, but the first thing for me would be something would be called matching. That's of course also related to the outreach, but I think the focus, probably at least in the Netherlands, has mainly been on universities selecting the students that fit them. But I think it should actually be two-way, and that's something that we are getting more attention for in the Netherlands right now. And it also refers a bit to the first research finding regarding when we compared people that got in via lottery and via selection, we actually found something which was called a participation effect, which implied that there was not so much a difference between those that were selected and were rejected while participation in the selection procedure, but there was a huge difference with those who did not even did not even use the selection route, because at that time you could either choose to just do the lottery or do selection, and if you got rejected you could still try to enter via the lottery. And so from that research we concluded that it is at least important that someone has to do something for his application for medical school, to really think about, is this what I want to do and why do I want to do it, just beyond just ticking a box. And if you just select on a high grades, for example, it's mainly about ticking a box, and it's not about really, finding out whether this medical school or other school fits you or not. And I think that's really crucial, to get people to get to do something. So just not about only ticking a box. So that, and in that way, we could also try to get a more diverse population. I'm not sure, can I still continue my remark, or you?
Yeah,
No, because what we also see with medical school is that there has been a real focus on the academically best students, which actually will probably fill the places at the academic institutions, while we also need medical doctors in the outskirts, and so we need a lot of different types of doctors. So that's why we also need a diverse student population, and we actually, by focusing more on matching and also showing them the different types of doctors that we need, we actually hope to attract more a more diverse applicant pool than just focusing on the academic criteria.
That's really interesting, and it has some commonalities actually with what Harry said.
Yeah.
That there is an element of this around allowing people to imagine themselves, or enabling people to imagine themselves at university, when and the kind of diversity of opportunities that university represents, and the different ways that someone can go to and sort of do university, and the different reasons for doing that. Omar, any comments?
Yeah, no, I mean, just picking up on that, as I said, there's evidence both from the US and India that doctors from those disadvantaged backgrounds are also more likely to practice in neighborhoods that currently have worse public health outcomes. So there's a kind of objective metric. And I think this is kind of the sort of corollary of my first point, of my main point, which is I do think we need to sort of accept that there will be some element of preference for targeted populations in admissions if we want them to be fair. And we have to get on the front foot in that in two ways, because I think we can be quite defensive in making that argument that that looks unfair, that the best candidates are not getting a job. And I think getting on the front foot means doing two or three things, and one of which is getting that evidence out there that Harry has outlined and that Karen has outlined, that I tried to outline, that these candidates actually end up doing perfectly well, if not better than they would have done otherwise, and that this contributes to their well-being and also to tackling group-based inequalities in our societies. But as I suggested in my presentation, I also think we should start thinking about attending university as a public good. And there is a question of how it should be distributed in our societies. Something like medical college, my understanding, Karen can correct me if I'm wrong, is one of the reasons the lottery was originally envisaged in the Netherlands is there was a recognition that this was a scarce resource that provided a huge benefit to those who went through it, and that it was quite difficult at the margin to decide why candidate A versus candidate B went through this. And so this was viewed as a question of how, not just individuals access medical college, but what we as a society want fairness to look like in terms of the benefits that flow from being a doctor. And being a doctor is both socially prestigious and generates significantly larger incomes than not being a doctor. And so I think getting on the front foot with those kinds of arguments is going to be important in the UK if we feel that there's a challenge to contextualize admissions, for example.
Absolutely, and so I want to pick up a little bit on this public good point, and also on a question that someone has put in the chat that Harry responded to for the American case, which is around government's role in fair admissions and the extent to which governments get involved in this and why. And what we've seen in the UK, I think it's fair to say, is that the government has varied a bit on its level of enthusiasm for intervening with in the admission system to try and kind of balance fairness versus merit, as you might kind of put it in scare quotes. And I wondered if you have any sort of reflections on that, on if higher education is a public good, then that creates a case for government intervention, but governments either haven't seen it as a public good, or haven't seen that there is a case for them to intervene in the distribution of that public good, or in some cases they have. Do you have any reflection on the role that government plays, should play, could play in sort of in securing fairer access to university? I will go to whoever would like to take that on. Karen?
Yeah, I think Omar already made a nice summary of the Dutch reason to get into lottery in the first place. But I think, in the Netherlands, it's by far a political debate on whether we should now introduce the lottery or not. And it's basically about this question: what do we think is fair in for this public good? And society is changing in that, and that's why you really see the two camps now: the ones that still have the old feeling of everyone should be treated equally and everyone should have a fair chance or the similar chance of getting into medical school, and the more individualized tradition, getting also mainly from the US and maybe other countries as well, like that the ones that did best or are proven to be the best should get the place. And that's really a forced debate where we're really struggling now. And that's, I think now we will in the future get a little bit in the middle, that medical schools that or institutions that want to use lottery will be enabled to do so, but others that still want to use the selection procedure are also able. So it will be like, which is also quite Dutch, just to get somewhere in the middle and have all the options open for institutions to choose themselves. So yeah.
I think that raises an interesting point around different types of fairness as well, because the data you present suggests that the lottery produces a fairer distribution of access, but it doesn't feel as fair to participants because they have less role in that process. And so there is, maybe slightly off-piste for this discussion, but I think there's kind of an interesting point there around different kinds of fairness and how you kind of trade those off against each other as well.
Yeah.
Harry or Omar, do you want to come in on the role of government?
Well, I mean, my answer to the question in Q&A question was actually not true. I realized. So the federal government has no role, right? It has no official role in education at all. Actually, all it does is provide money. But that's not quite true, because the Supreme Court, which is an arm of government, and really a sort of super legislature. I mean, those people, they make law. They just pretend that they're not making it. So around affirmative action, which is an important part of admissions, the Supreme Court decides what you're allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do. And one Supreme Court decision, or a series of decisions in the late 70s, which I think are pretty terrible decisions, outlawed affirmative action based on backward-looking. You can't use affirmative action as a way of sort of doing reparations, but you can use it as a way of promoting diversity. And so the diversity language, which I don't really like the diversity language at all. I think it's a sort of, well, whatever. And I don't think it flies very well in the UK sort of culture. But that language has been used to it's been used to shift the way we think about merit. And I think if you think about merit in terms of, who did the best in the past, well, that's, then you're going to have these feelings of unfairness. Well, I did the best in the past, so I should get the stuff. If you think about merit in terms of the likelihood that you're actually going to make a really valuable contribution to society, which seems a much more sensible way of thinking about merit. Well, then if we have evidence that lower income students are more likely to serve as doctors or as teachers or as social workers or as leaders of social work institutions, social work departments in places where there's need, then we have a reason, like, that's valuable. I'm not saying that being a banker or being being somebody who sort of manages the price of capital isn't valuable. That's valuable too. But so is something where you may not have the high math scores. Still, you're going to make a contribution that we have reason to value. And so that forward looking, I mean, I think Omar puts it in terms of public good. I'm not sure that's quite the way I would put it, but that forward looking understanding of merit is really an important cultural shift, I think. In our case, the Supreme Court actually had a role in that, although it doesn't have any role, the federal government doesn't have any official role in really changing enrollment practices. And most state governments don't either, except through, most state governments don't try to impose that role, except obviously by providing money.
Yeah. And I just wanted to jump in also to answer one of the, well, not fully answer, but to respond to one of the Q&A questions here on UK's centralized admissions. And Harry might correct me if I'm slightly wrong on this. I think one advantage of the UK centralized admissions system is that it could collect data on family background and on income and on disadvantage more accurately. So I think one of the things that happens in the US which is very, very targeted, but is arguably a waste of money to have every single institution do it, is that they all collect statements on people's kind of financial situation and then offer them an individualized financial aid package. Whereas in the UK, if we did this right, you could see, UCAS or whoever collecting that at a centralized level, and every single provider that the student applies to being aware of that. So it would be a much more efficient way of transmitting information about family background and income in terms of providers who are interested in using that information to make it a contextualized offer. So I think that could be a huge pro. I think the con is presently, my understanding is that information is not effectively provided to individual institutions. So they have to use proxy measures.
And one difference, Omar, between Australia and the UK is that in Australia, that process, the centralised admissions, are managed by government, whereas obviously here it's managed by a body that is sort of the sector. Although to be honest, I don't know that the Australian states systems that are doing that are collecting data effectively, but they kind of have a slightly different opportunity to do that.
I just want to pick up, because there's also another question in the chat on the Equality Act. The socioeconomic is not currently a grounds. It was in the original legislation, but it hasn't progressed in secondary legislation. So it is not a ground on which in the UK. So there's been a lot of interest in that, and it may be something that this or future governments would reconsider.
Absolutely. Okay, I'm going to ask the COVID question now, the obligatory COVID question. How do you think COVID-19 has reshaped the challenges faced by institutions? Oh, and Harry, I see we've been joined by your co-panelist.
Yeah, that's right.
Better late than never. So yeah, how has COVID-19 changed the landscape for institutions in these systems around fairer approaches to admissions? Has there been ways? So for example, in the UK, one thing that has happened is that a lot of events which would have been in person have moved online, which obviously has pros and cons, but one of the pros is that someone who couldn't travel to that event can now join it from where they are. And so, in that sense, there's been a little bit of an advantage, but counterbalanced with, I think, fairly significant disadvantages around being able to come on campus, for example, for visits and that sort of thing. So have there been challenges that you've seen? Has COVID changed the landscape? What would be better or worse or different going forward, do you think?
Well, I can say two things about the US. So the first is COVID prompted a big change in admissions behavior, which is that in the first COVID spring, the many institutions made taking the SAT optional or ACT optional, and the reason they did that was because suddenly you couldn't take the SAT, right? So I mean, in that spring, those scores weren't available, and I think that most institutions have gone SAT, ACT optional, and will stay that way. I think for a while, at least for a while, maybe for good. I don't know. I think that's probably a good thing. I don't know how good a thing it is, because the benefits that you get, the socioeconomic disparities in ACT scores are reflected in other bits of information we have. The other thing that I think we should be very aware of is that there is a huge amount of learning loss, and that learning loss, I mean, this is in all the way right down to kindergarten, and that learning loss is not equal across socioeconomic classes. It is much greater in some than in others, and the inequalities of educational sort of advantage and achievement are greater now, and will continue to be greater for, I think, years. And admissions officers are going to have to be dealing with that, and that's really bad.
Absolutely. Yeah. Karen or Omar, do you want to come in on that? Or on COVID?
Yeah, I think I can agree on what Harry is saying, and I think that in the Netherlands there's not been a huge change actually in the actual admission procedures. There's only more difficulty, of course, in using grades, because the final exams has been postponed, and even in the previous years there have been less exams than planned. So that even, I think, even made the call for the introduction of the lottery even louder, because people realized that the use of grades might have even more disadvantage than people were already thinking. However, the discussion on lottery is also, it's a bit, how do you say it? Actually, people are talking about different things when they're talking about lottery, because people will all say we want the lottery back, but some of them will think of a weighted lottery, a lottery which is weighted for grades, and others are really talking about an unweighted lottery. So, and especially to get more diversity, of course, the unweighted lottery is the best, just a lottery with the same chances for everyone. But that's a big step to take. Basically, also what I mentioned earlier in my presentation on why we actually got into the selection procedures in the first place is that even people at that time, even people with the highest grades possible, were able to get not into medical school, and that was something that we really didn't want to happen anymore. So that's basically discussion on that.
Yeah, I would also agree. I think this, I mean, it's in the chat as well, and Harry's point around the learning loss. I think that's really key. Also, thinking about another point Harry made around support, right? So I think there's often this argument that, well, contextualized admissions will mean that kids who aren't ready in the UK context for universities will fail, will drop out, won't do well. And I think Harry's argument that, it's really that it's not that you just sort of reduce standards or something and let people in and don't do anything else to support them. You don't do anything else in terms of early intervention. And I think arguably, if we're thinking about extending this further in the UK, that learning loss means that the levels of support will have to be even more, right? So I think providers will be having to think about investing more to support young people from disadvantaged backgrounds who have experienced greater learning loss than others, even as we need to see their representation increase. So it means that investment is going to have to be even greater. And I think maybe we need to be open and honest about that. I think the second thing, and I think it is a positive. I mean, one of the things that the fact that the grading was so uncertain here in the UK around A levels and GCSEs was this use of the algorithm. And I think there was some sort of confused and in fact kind of sort of quite silly criticisms of the algorithm that was used to predict grades or to revise predicted grades. But one thing it did expose is that one of the things that the algorithm is it's a form of contextualization, right? So it's sort of at least put in the public mindset, I think, greater recognition of the way in which making decisions about interventions it's difficult to follow straightforwardly, purely from grades. And so it at least opened the discussion of, if we are going to contextualize, if we are going to use an algorithm, if we don't have grades, if grades have been inflated to the point where universities can't make distinctions any longer, how else are we going to make those decisions fairly? So that conversation has been opened up. I'm not saying that it's been managed or responded to correctly, but I think that's one of the other things that COVID has opened up.
Absolutely. So someone in the chat has asked a question about finance and where the cost of courses and the financial support provided to young people, students from underrepresented backgrounds fits into this. And Harry, you talked a bit about the situation in the US here, but we in the UK have been waiting for I think 18, I don't know, time gets away from me, maybe 18 months now for the response to the Olga review, which proposed a pretty substantial overhaul to the way that universities are funded, which includes some implications for widening participation funding and also implications for how long people pay off their student loans. And we've seen, the loss of maintenance loans in a lot of cases as well. Do you have any reflections on how finance funding the cost of university can help or hinder fair access and fair participation in university? I think I haven't gone to Omar first yet, so I'm going to go to Omar.
Well, I won't say much other than I think it's absolutely vital. It's not just a question of fees. Obviously, the additional support that Harry's outlined. And as I said, with learning loss now, I think it's arguably we need even more investment. On our toolkit on our homepage, we do indicate that financial support is there's strong evidence that this works to increase participation amongst disadvantaged young people. So I'll end there.
Karen or Harry, any additional reflections?
I completely agree with that. And I mean, in the, just about the US, I'm kind of opinionated about this. In the US, there's this sort of movement for free public college. I think that's a mistake. If you're going to be spending an additional however many $1 billion, I mean, we're talking about $58 billion a year on public college, make sure, don't just use it to make it tuition free for lower income students, but also make sure that cost of attendance is free for them. Make sure you've got maintenance grants, make sure that, and be spending more money on lower income students, K through 12 and pre-K. That's where if what you want is to get a more even participation, that's where your money has got to go.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've got a question in the chat, which I think actually raises a really interesting and important difference between the systems we're talking about that we haven't really sort of zeroed in on, which is the views about the benefits of 4 versus 3-year degrees, whether the provision sort of pushes specialization on people quite young, and whether, to kind of range a bit more broadly than the question, whether the university system can be a little bit restrictive for young people, especially young people from underrepresented backgrounds who might have different needs in terms of what else they need to be doing at the same time. I will say one really stark difference between Australia and the UK, for example, is the extent to which in the UK, if you graduate from school, you go straight into university, you study full-time for 3 years, and then you probably do a master's and then that kind of thing. Whereas in Australia, it's much more modular. So, a lot of people will do a year, take a year out, come back, they will go part-time for a couple of semesters and then go back to full-time afterwards. You can basically, you've got 10 years to finish your degree. And if you don't sign up for subjects in that term, then, you can just come back the next term and do however many you like. And the system is much, much, much more flexible and much more permeable over the course of when you're doing your degree, which I think is probably helpful across the board, actually, not just for underrepresented students. I think a certain amount of that flexibility probably helps people to figure out what they want to do and when. But so the US, mostly 4-year degrees, generally a fairly generalist first year and then kind of specialization after that, whereas the UK narrows in very sharply, very quickly. I know I'm not sure about the Indian or Dutch cases, but any comments on flexibility, 4-year versus 3 years specialization? Does it help?
Specialization obviously rewards people who've been better prepared in high school, right? I mean, in secondary school, because they just are much more likely to know what they're good at and what they're inclined to do. So the very, very early specialization is tremendous advantage to people who have already had a lot invested in them. I don't know how you change that I don't know if there's any appetite to change that in UK higher education institutions. I'd be surprised if there is.
Yeah, I think not at that end, but the 2-year community college kind of link that is sometimes understood a bit here. I think there are analogies, and the sort of interest in modularization, I think, is whether or not it can be provided in a very different institutional and secondary environment is a question. But I think there is a notion that FE colleges could do more to step in, that higher education providers could work more with FE colleges, that this lifelong learning loan that the government is developing could fill this space. And I think there is potential there, and to sort of cover some of the gaps that Susanna, you and Harry have both identified there. But we're kind of waiting to see where that policy develops. But I think there is reasons to think that could cover, they could improve participation.
Yeah, absolutely. Any comments from you, Karen?
No, I think we in the Netherlands basically follow the rigid system from the UK. So also a 3-year bachelor program directly mostly for school leavers. But it might change in the near future, but we're not there yet. So yeah. no really useful insight by
I
now.
didn't
I
say,
think.
yeah, and I didn't say the Indian case is usually 4 years. And actually, the one thing I really didn't say, because I've been speaking about the UK is in the Indian case, there is a lot of what Harry described as well to support students, and what Mary Kernock Cook referred to also, the sort of foundation year, the support in the summer beforehand. One of the big features of the Indian case that needs to be understood is that most university is conducted in English medium language, but most disadvantaged people go to public schools where the medium of education is the regional or national language, so Hindi, Gujarati, Bengali, Kannada, and they are at a huge disadvantage in their first year trying to write essays in English for the first time, whereas all of the middle-class children tend to go to fee-paying private English medium schools, so they've been learning in English from the age of 7 or 11 and have been writing essays in English. So obviously there's a huge gap there that needs to be closed.
Absolutely. So we've got about 3 minutes left in our session. So I'm going to throw over to the panelists for any very brief closing reflections or thoughts, and I might go to Karen first.
So no general question, just a closing remark. Yeah, I hope I have shed some light on how you could use the lottery. I must admit myself that I'm not a totally fond on just only using lottery. I think it should always be used in combination to also, to have different routes of getting into medical school. I think that one of my key issues is that a good selection system consists of different strands so that people with different qualities can get into university. So there's just not only the ones with the high grades or the ones that stand out on something else, but people with different qualities should be able to get in. So I think we should use a system that benefits different types of students to get in. So that would be my final remark.
Thank you so much. Omar, any final thoughts?
Well, I think I kind of outlined in my presentation that I think we should be thinking about targeted approaches in the UK. I think it's unlikely. I mean, we've heard that we'll adopt wholesale anything from India or from the Netherlands or from the US, but I think there are lessons that we can learn about, also, I mean, the Dutch case is interesting because lotteries were implemented and then there was sort of public concern about them. So the final point I think I would make is this is an area that does need, whether or not you view it as a public good, we need to make public arguments about this, that there needs to be public support for the system overall, public support specifically for improving fairness for underrepresented and disadvantaged groups, and that support is also a political question. So it's something that I think can't be wholly evaded. But I think finally the evidence from the international cases is not only that this can be done, but that the outcomes for the students who are so targeted are actually quite positive, not just for them in terms of higher earnings, but for society in terms of better provision of public goods and less wasted resources and less wasted lives. So that's my final comment.
Thanks, Omar. And Harry, anything from you to wrap up?
I think I would just want to echo that. I mean, the policy change is really important. Figuring out what the policy changes should be is like, that's your job. I mean, I don't know what the answer to that is, but it seems like plenty is feasible. But culture change is important too, because no policy change is going to be sustainable. And if it goes wrong, right, you want people to think, okay, how do we amend it? Not, oh, well, we need to get rid of it now. And for that, you need a culture change, and it needs to go all, that the arguments have to be made. They have to be made publicly. They have to be made throughout higher education, throughout secondary education, as well as with policymakers and the public.
Great, thank you so much. So it remains only to thank all three of our panelists for their time and their insight. I found this to be a really interesting conversation, and I'm sure that all of our attendees have as well.